night sky tells his tale, but the only listening eyes are mine.
Stagnation, that was a journey song, as I call it. You know, that you didn't follow the normal verse, chorus sort of structures, but you went on through a series of landscapes, and I think right from the word go, that was something that interested me, and it continues to interest me in sort of stuff that I do. I mean, more often now it's sort of film work than film soundtrack stuff, but I love that, and I think some of my favorite pieces of music are when I, as a listener, get taken into different worlds made out of sound, and if there are some things that you've not encountered before or blends that you haven't met before, then it pays off even better for me. So I think that's what we were aspiring to, and that's, I think, one of the tracks that did that, and I think that was probably one of the most band-composed tracks on the record.
The Stagnation developed out of a piece that we'd had rather pretentiously called The Movement, which we'd been rehearsing for sort of like for a long time before we played it on stage or anything. And it developed, this thing at one point was about 30 minutes long, and it sort of got condensed, and bits came and bits left. But the first bit stayed. So it was always a sort of key song for us.
It was really a sort of 2 12-string thing that Tony got in on very early, and it wasn't just right to say that, you know, we did the sort of chordal basis and Tony just put solos on top. It was more than that. I think his sort of kind of cross rhythms and cross harmonies influenced the way that the 12-string harmony went. Again, it was fun because you had this feeling that maybe we're just going somewhere slightly differently to other people in a very natural way.
Peter used to play a lot of flute, really. It was nice for us to have an instrument. You must understand, those days, obviously, keyboards meant just organ and piano, really. That's all there was. And I sort of got a fuzz piano going, piano through a fuzz box, which got some good sounds on it. But the flute, which Peter played, was a very strong thing. And he wasn't a great flute player, and he would never say he was, but it was a lovely touch in there. And, and things like Stagnation, is the melody, the big melody at the end, the sort of riff that carries on and on, starts off as a flute thing. And it's a really nice thing, and it was a really nice quality to have in there, I think. Obviously later, once the sort of mellotrons and everything came in and synthesizers, we sort of, it went by the wayside. But it was, it also gave Pete something else to do when we were writing songs. I mean, he didn't just sort of sing, we were banging tambourines and the rest of it. Obviously sometimes it gets a bit frustrating, I think, for him, because he was a person who'd like to have had his hands on the keys quite a lot of the time, but I wouldn't let him, So he could play the flute, and then that would be a nice way of writing it. It would give one a sort of another dimension to the sound.
I just hated the idea of being just the singer, that as soon as the lyrics, which never got heard much because bad PA systems in those days, stopped, you were left with nothing to do musically. So you either had to prance around or get off stage or stand still. Whereas I wanted to, I was full of music. I wanted to play something. Tony was extraordinarily possessive about the keyboard. Flute, I'd done a bit of at school. I always liked the sound and a little bit of oboe. I was even worse oboe player, but it made a couple of good noises now and again. And then the bass drum was something physical, visceral that I could kick hard. And occasionally it was in time. So that was important to me, to be in the noise-making department as well as the singing.
Stagnation to the knife is a great example of what we do. The contrasts are always how we create our music, in a sense. And that album, starting with Stagnation and then having the knife on it, which is our heaviest song, and a popular live song too.
Tell me my life is about to begin. Tell me that I'm a hero. Promise me all of your violent dreams. Light up your body with anger.
Well, The Knife was a very popular stage song. And we used to construct our set in those early days. One thing we used to start acoustic, and I used to play a lot of guitar. And it would start with the first 2 or 3 songs I'd play guitar on, and then with Stagnation would be the first sort of song that had anything else in it. And of course that song itself develops, starts off with just the guitars, and then the keyboards come in, and there's even an organ solo, and then the whole thing becomes drums and everything comes, and there's a big thing at the end. So, and then The Knife was the kind of final song in the set, and it always got the audience that, they always loved it. It was that sort of the dum, chick, dum, chick, dum rhythm, you know, it was just sort of always, you know, even people who weren't sort of quite sure what we were on about, they heard that and their heads were all going, you know. So it was a key song for us in those early days, and it became very much, I think, for that first sort of year or two we were touring, the key song, the trademark Genesis song.
I'll give you the names of those who must kill, all must die with their children, carry the heads to the palace of old, hang them high, let the blood flow.
Well, The Knife used to be known as The Nice because we were big fans of The Nice, and I'd sat around. There was an energy. The Nice, you know, people, not many people know much of their work nowadays, but it was what actually drew us into Tony Stratton Smith. And although, you know, Keith Emerson was, you know, associated with some of the sort of more extreme departures of prog rock on the keyboard, then it was a sort of hip underground band that Hendrix wanted to join. Now, people forget that, but they were amazing. It was powerful. It was sort of inventive, driving. I mean, maybe Soundgarden might be a sort of modern day, well, latter day reference. And obviously Emerson was a great performer. He used to sort of rock forward and back with the knife. And I was thinking, and there we would be, you know, sitting on stools, twiddling away at 12 strings, you know, and you'd think, you know, where's the balls in this? Let's get something with a bit of energy and a bit of something a little dangerous. So we didn't have anything like that, so I started to try and write something that would have that energy, and that's really how things began. And then Tony added a section to it, and obviously the keyboard thing at the end. But I think it was the first sort of peak of a darker energy that we discovered, if you like.
Standing in a forest, gazing.
That was a very early actual piano song from me, pre the first album, in fact. I mean, it was sort of in 1960, early in 68. I mean, I couldn't play the piano at all in a conventional way. I used to play with 3 fingers in my right hand, octaves there, and then I would cross over and play a tune there, which is very bizarre, and I think Tony thought I was an idiot, which would be understandable. But like a lot of idiots, sometimes you come up with something that's quite just a little bit different, you know, and it has something, because I was helped by the fact that I was very limited. You know, sometimes too much skill isn't necessarily a good idea.
Visions of angels on a rock, dance in the sky.
You know, there was that sort of plodding sort of piano style that was very fashionable. The Beach Boys had done it a lot. Beatles were doing it a lot. Things like With a Little Help from My Friends, that sort of plod rhythm. And so, I mean, that fitted well with my octave, dun, 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 that kind of thing. Which the middle section with Tony's keyboard, the chords, and all that sort of glory that it gave, it made so much difference to it. And obviously, it was actually a song that was quite well suited to being dramatised a bit. You know, both vocally and in Peter's performance, and with the organ. So I'm sure if it had worked on Genesis to Revelation, we would never have done it. So in fact, that was a nice consolation for it not working out, because I remember at the time I was rather heartbroken, because it was definitely my flagship song from Genesis to Revelation, and it got chucked off. You know, I didn't argue about it, but you know, I didn't know it was ever going to see the light of day. So yeah, that was a really nice bonus, and that was one of the few, well, it was the only one from that previous era that survived.
Looking for someone. I guess I'm doing that.
That was another one that was sort of, you know, felt like a song which I'd brought to the band, and the band had then extended, and it was a sort of soul-influenced piece. But it then went into this sort of folkier journey. And I really was pleased with that mixture.
Trying to find a needle in a haystack. Chilly wind, you're piercing like a dagger. It hurts me so.
It was, it was fun to sing. I always liked to try and have, in the different voices I work within, to have a bluesy one, and that was more sort of soul influenced.
In peaceful shades of green.
Our relationship, obviously, with Peter was a very close friend of mine at school, and Ant and Mike were the same, and then we sort of coming together there. And obviously on this album we had John Mayhew as the drummer, who was the person who was actually our third drummer. Someone we picked up really through through ads and stuff and everything, and we were sort of slowly getting some cohesion going, I think, between the five of us in that way. It was quite difficult for John, I think, because we'd all been to the public school and behaved a certain kind of way, I think, which must have been very irritating to him, I'd have thought.
It was the summer of many drummers, many adverts, many auditions, people being picked up from stations, skullduggery, cloak and dagger stuff, who's going to tell him, and all that sort of stuff. It was awful, absolutely awful, because we loved John Silver, and John Silver decided to pack it up and go to the States for university. He didn't want to give it a go. John Mayhew was older than this. He was more experienced, but I think it was from a different background, and he was very unsure of himself with us. And I think we tried to do our best in our own rather lame way to make him feel comfortable, but I'm not sure we ever did. And he was a good drummer, but we were very demanding, very, very demanding. And I think he always felt he came up short. He didn't really. He did a fine job. The trouble is that history hasn't treated John well, because his successor happens just to have been one of the very, very special drummers. He not only was a drummer but a singer and all the rest of it. Brilliant musician. So I think, had they found a sort of more prosaic drummer afterwards, then history would speak more kindly about John. But he's cast in a rather dim light, which I always think is rather unfair. I think that we were pushing boundaries and trying to do this and probably being very demanding. And we'd spoken the same musical language. We'd grown up in the same environment for a long time. There's no way John could really understand what these toffs were on about most of the time. And I think he did a pretty decent job. It just wasn't clearly quite good enough.
We were used to sort of having this passive-aggressive tone to the rehearsals, because although Tony and I were best friends, we would be at loggerheads very often about the music.
It was very close, but we used to fight an awful lot, terrible arguments and shouting matches and going off. I was probably the main instigator of that kind of stuff.
He was then a lot more nervous and not at ease within himself. He would try and, in a tight way, hold on to controlling as much as he could in a lot of ways. And I would always want to push it wide open and, let the sunlight in and the rain and see what grew. And Ant and Mike, for the most part, got on pretty well, and occasionally, I would be in battling out with one of them, but Mike tended to avoid confrontation. And then, in later years, Phil and Steve would avoid the confrontation. But I think, Tony and I were the most frequently at odds.
We argued a lot because we were passionate. Also, we were young. Sexually frustrated, I don't know, all sorts of reasons it was just one of those things. We did feel intensely about it, really, and you find yourself, you look back on some of the arguments you had were just about sort of pretty trivial things, but when you're close to people like that and you're living on top of each other, little things can trigger an argument, which is about nothing at all. And that's first, the cottage period when we were just all living together, we weren't even hardly taking weekends off or anything. It was quite a strain on those people who did actually have relationships. So it was kind of, it was difficult, but it was intense. But it had some great moments there too, and I remember it, being as a sort of mixed period, really, some great moments and some violent moments, actually.